Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, January 7th, 2025. Happy birthday, Naomi. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine. Christine, are you muted? You are muted, so we didn't get to hear your
John.
hi.
I know. I am only on my first cup of coffee. I apologize.
That's okay.
It's the second day of a snow day here in Washington. So there are no rules.
And also buried in the snow, senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John. We're about 7% of the town is plowed. We are not part of that 7%, so we're working on it.
Good. Sounds like New York in some of its glory days. In its time, we got about a quarter of an inch. But that's okay. There's black ice everywhere.
All of this with scorn, though, because it's like 5 or 6 inches of snow, and we're paralyzed. So
well, so let's see what's going on. Trump's going to give a press conference later today, presumably to announce the annexation of Greenland and Canada, and of course, Canada now in the news because Justin Trudeau announced yesterday that he was a complicated maneuver, but he was stepping down as party leader or stepping down as prime minister, but he wouldn't step down as prime minister until the party chose his successor and there could be an election, giving his party a chance at not being completely wiped out, as the Conservative Party in Canada seems to be about 25 to 30 points ahead of Trudeau's Liberal Party. I was going to say that we could have a whole conversation about Trudeau and being a kind of himbo and having bad policies throughout COVID and like imprisoning truckers who were complaining about taxation and going after them with 2x4s and all kinds of things.
Supporting euthanasia,
Yeah, but doing nothing about anti-Semitism, all of that. But I mean, the salient detail about him, and I think this goes to this whole question of what's going on in the West with the rejection of all of its leaders, is that he's essentially been in power for almost 10 years uninterruptedly. And this is a strange set of circumstances that has beset the West in the 21st century, you could say, which the United States, of course, generally avoids because of the fact that we have a constitutional amendment limiting our leaders to 2 terms in office. A lot of what has gone on here with the sclerosis in Western Europe and elsewhere has to do with the fact that leaders stay too long at the fair. Angela Merkel, I think that's true of Trudeau. It was true of the Tories, though, of course, they had many leaders in a row. But nonetheless, the fact that we here, though you can say that our political system is not in the greatest shape, we're constantly bouncing back and forth, or really have been since the 1970s, between the parties having either ideological dominance or political dominance or something like that. Nobody has it for too long. Nobody can really seize it and make substantive changes. And in all these countries, leaders stay too long. They forget how to be leaders. They forget how to appeal to people. They lose their sense of touch for what voters want and what the ordinary people want. And I think my guess is that more than anything else explains Trudeau's collapse over the last year and a half, 2 years, because the unpopularity of his policies been very much evident for I don't know, half a decade. My friend Vivian Berkovich, who is a Canadian, Israeli, Jewish commentator, has been sort of going at Trudeau for, forever, and wondering at the fact that he has remained in power despite all kinds of scandals involving native populations and things like that. I just think you got to get off the stage.
I think, John, I'm sure that's true. But I think it coincides. This stretch of time where leaders in the West are staying in power too long is also coinciding with something in the culture in the West, which is this sort of unwillingness to buy the official story all over. And I think COVID, because it was global, played a part in this. This sort of pushback on what a lot of politicians and leaders had taken for granted as inevitable. A lot of sort of inevitable suppositions about what's good, where we're headed, what we're telling you, the compact between government and the people. And because so much of the West and so much of the world sort of looks to the U.S., having seen us rejected in so many ways, I think sort of spread that condition around.
I'll give you another example of this. So Bibi Netanyahu was prime minister of Israel for, Seth, was it 12 years?
Yeah.
It was 12 years. He lost his premiership in 2021 or 2022. I can't remember when. And then came back into power at the beginning of 2023. And it seemed clear from the resistance to him, though he had won this absolute majority for the first time in 7 years or something like that in Israeli politics in the parliament, that he did not he had misread and misunderstood the nature of the political challenge that he faced coming back into power. He endorsed these judicial reforms, which I think substantively are largely correct, but he misjudged what was going to happen when he did this. And had it not been for October 7th, changing the dynamic inside Israel and playing to his strengths, I don't know how much longer he would have survived. And that was a sort of weird fact that he had stayed too long at the fair, lost his premiership, got it back, and then showed that maybe that had been an unwise choice on his part because his command of the levers of power was halting. That's an interesting thing to think about in relation to Donald Trump now, because Trump will be starting his presidency. It will effectively mean that he will be the dominating person in American politics for 12 years when he finishes his second term. And that, maybe people are beginning this term with optimism. We talked about yesterday about how he seems to be running the transition much better, and they have plans, and it's quieter and calmer and all of that. But 12 years atop a party, that's a long time. And he's old. And I don't know. I think that there was something in the decision to limit the presidency to 2 terms after Franklin Roosevelt's death that has made a huge difference in American politics for the better, that parliamentary systems obviously don't necessarily hew to.
Well, and that'll be the test both here in the U.S. and Canada's about to go through its own test of populism as just merely a blip, a historical reactionary blip, or can you have second generation populism? So if J.D. Vance is able as vice president to shape the Trump movement into something that he can run on himself, if he chooses to run for president in 4 years, and is successful, then we have second generation sort of populism. And the guy nipping at the heels in Canada of Trudeau, also sort of a sort of mini Trump, a little more. It's funny, these Canadian politicians are much better looking than our politicians, but he's attractive, he's articulate, and he speaks, to Abe's earlier point, he speaks in a very direct way that addresses a lot of the concerns of the people who are very online and very conspiratorial at times, but absolutely correct about their government lying to them.
Look, I was just in Italy, and I had the interesting experience of going on a Jewish tour of Rome with a tour guide who was asked by one of the people, very literate woman from a Roman Jewish family. That means that her family has been in Rome for 2,000 years. Not that that they migrated after the war or came after the Spanish Inquisition, but have been there forever. And she said that what was interesting to her is that Giorgia Meloni became prime minister of Italy, and everybody that she knew and everybody that was friends with her and all that, they all thought that Giorgia Meloni was a fascist. And then October 7th happened, and for somebody like her, a Jew among 35,000 Jews in the city, or in the whatever, in the country, very tiny population. How the government relates to Israel is an extraordinarily pressing issue, particularly given the rise in anti-Semitism, Muslim immigration into Italy, and all of that, and that they were startled to discover that she was a friend of Israel, that the official narrative about her being a fascist was not one. Once she got to know Maloney's politics on a day-to-day basis, did not represent what she thought fascism was. And we get this now all over Europe, right? There's this fight going on over the populist right-wing party in Germany, which we are simply told is a neo-fascist party. I'm not literate enough in the in the interstices of German politics to understand how it fits in with Germany's own complicated political relationships. But I think, as to Abe's point, I have no confidence anymore that the people that I would listen to who would say, "Oh my God, this party is terrible and it's so dangerous, and they hate minorities, and they're going to be anti-Semitic," and it's really, I have no confidence that that line is true. Just like I think people who may be confused or concerned about Viktor Orban's leadership in Hungary have been sold a bill of goods about how he is an authoritarian neo-fascist. There are many issues you could disagree with Viktor Orban on and how he handles things, but that simply was a kind of pulled off the shelf line about a ideologically conservative, non-globalistic leader that everyone just said, okay, great. Okay, well, he's a fascist. The Germans are fascists. Maloney's a fascist.
Well, especially because they told us that they were all the same, right? So it was like Viktor Orban and Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu and Boris Johnson. We were told are all part of the same trend.
Yeah,
Those
and they all
trends are
work for
so
Putin.
different.
I mean, it all, there's a kind of off-the-shelf quality to these objections, and as Abe says, I think even for people like us who are not inclined, I think, toward paranoia about official lines and things like that, I think we've just learned that we better keep our powder dry and learn more about these people and pay more attention if you really want to pay attention to the issue. Just you can't accept the conventional wisdom
I mean,
about anybody.
I think we live in a different world in a lot of ways. I think October 7th is a contributing factor, and so too is the explosion of the modern American liberal project this year in the U.S. It's hard for me not to be very U.S. centric about this, but something's been punctured, and it's this effort to render anyone that's anywhere to the right of you as beyond the pale. That was such a concerted effort. It was so total. It was so international. And then it sort of disintegrated all at once. And we'll see what the next iteration is.
Well,
I also
Christine,
think that with John, with what you're talking about, there's two things also that come to mind in your observation about Rome. One is that the last time I was there, I believe that they still referred to the historic Jewish part of Rome as the ghetto. They still called it the Jewish ghetto. And so I think that that brings to mind the fact that things in Europe for Jews are different than they are in America.
although the ghetto is now like Soho, or
Right,
it's like
right.
Silver Lake or something like that.
And by the way, in terms of kosher food, Rome is really hard to beat. in terms
Well,
of.
I had a really bad meal there, so
Oh,
I
okay.
gotta
Well,
I'm gonna have to object on maybe I just had maybe the restaurant I was in they had an off
we
day.
went on our honeymoon to Barcelona
Yeah,
and Rome, and Barcelona is a wonderful, beautiful, great city with no kosher food.
yeah,
And Rome was like you're not allowed to flag a taxi down in the street, but they have great kosher food.
yeah.
But Europe is the memory is different, right? So Jews in Europe and sort of snap back into place. You talk about somebody who's a Jewish family been in Rome for 2,000 years or whatever. It's like the institutional memory operates differently. So that's one thing that's different is that Jews in Hungary and those places, part of it is that they don't have to be lectured about nationalism in Central Europe, right? In Hungary and places like that. They know they're there, right? They're aware of how things can spin out. They don't need necessarily Americans telling them, but also they can see the differences. But the institutional memory is just sharper. And so when you talk about Israel, when they see Georgia Maloney um, is actually something of a friend to Israel, or is on the same wavelength on some of these issues, and Israel was the thing that brought it to the surface, that memory kicks in, in terms of who Jews in Europe are looking for, and to be on their side. The other thing is that Israel is like the great destroyer of conventional wisdom. Right? You hear all these stories. You talk to a lot of conservatives. How many conservatives became conservative because they say the first thing that they realized the establishment and the media were lying to them about was Israel, right? How many times have you heard that story? Somebody's journey from left to right began with Israel. Jewish Insider has an interview with Brianna Wu of Gamergate today. Same thing, the journey from left to right. Why? Because when you're steeped in this stuff, you know the difference.
Right.
And we used to call this in my house. We used to call this the economist effect, where when you actually know about something, you see BS like really easily, no matter whether it's said with the voice of God or not.
Yeah.
And then you realize, well, that whole special section on Djibouti or whatever later in the Economist magazine, maybe that's also not
Right.
true.
Well, we should explain that the Economist was uniquely and because it was considered a sort of conservative publication. The Economist was unbelievably and unimaginably anti-Israel in the 80s and 90s. So its coverage of the Middle East was so loathsome and noxious that even though it seemed very authoritative as a publication and so high flown and all of that, when you turn to other things in the magazine, it led you towards skepticism. Christine, I wanted to point out that, as Abe said, there's been this collapse of the liberal consensus or the power that it seems to have. And we have this very interesting thing going on with one of your bugbears in social media, Facebook, which of course which you called for the breakup of in the pages of commentary a couple of years ago. Mark Zuckerberg has basically decided in the last 10 days that he is whitewashing his hands of the Facebook posture that he assumed out of nervous defensiveness in the wake of the 2016 election, when people said that Facebook had gotten Trump elected by allowing misinformation in its pages. And so what did he do? He empowered these committees to examine the fairness, or they shadow banned or quieted stories down. He hired Nick Clegg, the head of the Social Democrats in Britain, to be the content chairman of Facebook. He apologized repeatedly to Congress for being terrible. He did all of this stuff. He said he changed the name of the company. He said they were going to do glasses instead of, he was they're going to basically be a VR company and an AI company instead of a place where you showed people the pictures of your high school reunion. And now, in the last 10 days, he has fired Nick Clegg. He has hired Joel Kaplan, former deputy chief of staff, who worked at Facebook anyway, but has brought him in to be to replace Nick Clegg. He was the George W. Bush's deputy chief of staff. He has asked Dana White, the head of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, who introduced Trump at various things, was there on election night at Mar-a-Lago and spoke to join the board of Meta. And he announced this morning that they were ending all moderation at Facebook, and that they were going to follow the X policy of community notes on things that were controversial or questionable, allowing people in the Facebook community to establish what their disagreements with posts that seem to be problematic. That's an amazing. It's basically like, well, this is the election. There's a new sheriff, or the sheriff is back. I screwed up. I screwed up when he was sheriff in the first place, and I'm not going to make that mistake now. I have too many I don't know, who knows what he thinks. I have too many regulatory issues. I don't want to get in trouble with him. Or they sold me a bill of goods. I got sold a bill of goods by these people about how I needed to do this in order to preserve the integrity of Facebook. And in fact, they did the opposite. They made Facebook seem less interested, whatever. What's your take?
Well, I think the first thing to understand about Mark Zuckerberg is that he will forever and always see politics as an obstacle to the power he wants to amass. So he doesn't actually care who's in charge. He just sees it's a constant speed bump on his road to a much broader and vaster sense of what he wants to do, which is to function as a mini nation state. So he's not just dealing with politics here; he's dealing with it all across the world, because Facebook is this. It has more users outside of the United States now than it does in. I think it's comical that he was trapped up in the liberal bubble that we often talk about here. And there's a great piece that David Samuels, who's part of the Excellent County Highway crowd, wrote for Tablet just towards the end of the year, called Rapid Onset Political Enlightenment. And his argument, I think, captures a lot of what we see people like Zuckerberg and others who were part of the sort of censorship industrial complex online. Their shifts occurring now are completely explicable if you understand that they did think that they were on the right side of history when they were censoring conservatives, when they were censoring voices that opposed or questioned some of the judgments of, say, public health officials during COVID. So he is, I mean, Zuckerberg is I think Zuckerberg compares himself not to any particular political leader, but to, former Roman emperors, and says, now what could I do to get to that position? And so in this sense, Trump is just, he's going to court Trump the way he courted, Obama, and the way he courted Biden administration. The difference is that now there's some pushback from the people who he wants to keep on his platform. Americans who looked at what Facebook did under democratic regimes, looked at the lies that were promoted and the truths that were suppressed, and say, maybe we need to build our own platforms. Maybe we need to go elsewhere. Maybe we actually shouldn't trust the judgment of these so-called Facebook fact checkers. Now, I'll add that Facebook also for a while had these relationships with publications, including at the time the Weekly Standard, where there were sort of expert fact checker institutions, mainly on the left, but a few, handpicked on the right as well, to sort of give feedback to Facebook about the kind of content that it was promoting and the way that it promoted that stuff. And I think that also was a form of window dressing. I know some of my colleagues at the time thought it was a good sign, but you need to understand Meta in particular as having a long-term strategy when it comes to this stuff. So if in 4 years, a very left-wing progressive becomes the president of the United States, they will shift immediately back to that side of the aisle too. For them, again, politics is an obstacle to power.
There was outrage too, you remember, on the left. The left was up in arms over the idea that the Weekly Standard should be part of a fact-checking operation. Right. That was one of the trends that was happening at the time, was that it was very clear that this whole movement against misinformation, disinformation, and all that was really just a political red team, blue team, left-right thing.
Well, that's Abe's.
I would say I don't think it started out that way. I think there were some, and there still are in academia, some thoughtful scholars really trying to get at how information spreads and what doesn't. And they're studying it as an ecosystem versus a political thing. But it very quickly, as Seth says, very quickly morphed into a weapon that particularly those on the left became extremely skillful at wielding against their political enemies. And Facebook abetted that.
And they had about them, as I think you point out, aside from the fact that they thought it was politically good for them, which I think we should get to, because of course it turned out that it really wasn't. In the long run, it was incredibly injurious to them. But that even if they were only doing it out of naked, raw Machiavellian reasons, the idea that they could sort of put their finger on the scale of what kind of information people got and from where, and that this would then help them with their advocacy of certain types of causes and politicians and all of that, they had the added benefit in their own psyches and in their own bubble of believing that in so doing, they were saving the country and the world from fascism. And that so, yes, maybe they were using the means that they were using were means that had it been like 4 or 5 years earlier, they would have been horrified by. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and you have to censor if the people that you are censoring themselves, in their minds, don't respect democratic norms, don't respect niceties, will do anything, will say anything, will throw anybody into jail, or will get people killed by the millions because of their horrible views on social distancing and vaccination and all of that. And so you're saving lives and you're saving democracy using pretty illiberal methods of doing so, which I think even they would acknowledge, right? Like saying the New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop should be shadow banned. It's not that the people who shadow banned it don't know that that's kind of like out of the norm of how information is supposed to spread in our First Amendment dominated system.
But the seductive thing about how these platforms are actually designed and what they reward, which is, as you say, they reward moral grandstanding. So if you're on the moral high ground in your own mind and everyone's telling you are, then you'll continue to do what you're doing. But look, Elon Musk had a big stumble this past week where he tried to ban a story and ban a reporter's account on X that led to a bit of a kerfuffle. And I think some honest people from the right were pointing out to Elon Musk, look, this is what happened with the New York Post laptop story. Don't do this. But the allure of having that sort of power is very difficult to.
Well, at least he owns it.
Corrupted by it, I would say.
At least that's like his house. I mean, Twitter is his house. He owns Twitter. Lock, stock, and barrel.
And I agree that he was wrong to do it. But also, the story was literally about him.
Right. So I'm just saying
that's bad that he does that. But it's also there isn't this sort of like, well, we're saving democracy from the dark night of fascism through misinformation. Elon Musk is like, hey, stop talking about me and my friends.
Yeah, I think centrally, after 2016, and this idea that Cambridge Analytica had somehow magically caused Donald Trump to get elected, that there was some kind of all hands on deck emergency set of meetings or conversations at Facebook where the idea would have been, we can't be seen as being this powerful. Number one, that's bad for my effort to become a shadow emperor, as Christine would say. I got to do this more quietly, number one. And number two, like, I don't want to be blamed for, changes in the democratic makeup of the West. What do we do about that? And it's like, oh, well, we've got some solutions. We can do this. We can do that. We can highlight this. We can ban. We can make sure. Look, we've already said we're not going to have pedophiles on here, and we're not going to have Nazis on here. Well, I mean, maybe somebody who says vaccination is bad isn't a pedophile, but effectively they kill people, so they should be banned, or this one should be banned, or that one should be banned. And it's very seductive, particularly if you have the means at your disposal with, a button.
And this is why the TikTok is presenting a similar dilemma for the Trump administration, because it was, I think, correctly opposed to it on national security grounds, on privacy grounds, on the fact that it is on its
existence, on its presence in the United
propaganda.
States.
We know this, like, it's literally been studied.
Yeah.
That is, if you search for terms like Tiananmen Square on TikTok, you get propaganda. So but he shifted now because he's got a lot of followers on TikTok. He has reach on TikTok. So that's, again, to the point about how these platforms are designed. You can talk about design choices, I think, in a way that is nonpartisan, but the people who are winning on particular platforms don't want to do that because they're winning. So I think those debates will continue. I hope the Trump administration goes back to what its position was on TikTok, which is it's just clearly a matter of national security at this point. And you can build another
Supreme Court is
platform or
hearing,
sell it.
yeah. Supreme Court is hearing this case on some sort of emergency basis this week. So it's interesting that you bring that up. And I was listening to the Advisory Opinions podcast, Sarah Isger and David French's podcast at the Dispatch, and she was reading out details from this report on TikTok. And for example, if you search Uyghurs on YouTube, 55 or 60% of the content on YouTube will be negative toward the Chinese government. And if you search Uyghurs on TikTok, it's 12%. So, and there are like, I think 3 or 4 issues on which it is unambiguously the case that TikTok's management is
Isn't
playing
Israel
the algorithm.
Isn't the Israel-Hamas war one of those?
It is, but in this case, let's just say it is the specific policies of the Chinese government that you can track very plainly on TikTok, thereby making the case, which is the case that the legislation that was passed made, that it's a national security issue where information about China's behavior, China is successfully suppressing or confusing or screwing up the minds of the young who are disproportionately involved in TikTok.
Well, also hoovering up massive amounts of personal information from American citizens. That's the part that concerns me the most. But yes, the propaganda part of it is also very worrisome.
But I think, again, Zuckerberg and these, thought, and the prior owners of Twitter, right, Jack Dorsey and whoever the other guy was, Dick Costolo, they thought that they needed to protect themselves from the right wing mob that was going to destroy democracy and the left wing mob that was going to destroy them for not interfering enough. And so they interfered. And I think Zuckerberg took one look at 2023 and 2024 and said, I went the wrong way here. This has been of no use to me whatsoever. And all of the data that we have, Tom Edsall has another interesting piece on the future danger to the Democratic Party, or what the data now show about the Democratic Party. We've been talking about for the last week or so on the podcast. Patrick Rafi's discovery that there are now more Republicans than Democrats for the first time in, I don't know, a century or something like that. People identifying in that fashion, and it's just not, the behavior of the Biden administration in winning in 2020, how it handled the suppression of conversation about COVID, how it handled the lawfare toward Trump, all of that has led the Democratic Party down a very, very bad alley where their relation to the public that is not completely committed to the Democratic cause is not good.
And and this to tie it to the earlier point about what's happening in the West, largely a lot of these issues that we're talking about the Biden administration handling and the way they approached it aren't unique to the U.S. The migrant crisis, that's it. The Canadian border crisis is an issue up there. The transing of kids. You see now internationally, you see pushback in Europe on you see policy changes in terms of treating kids after all the BS studies have now been supplanted by some actual data on the harms and so on. So there's a whole host of issues that don't affect just the U.S., but that the liberal establishment of various countries have propped up only to see them collapse. And I think that those also contribute to this changed world.
It's glasnost.
It's a kind of glasnost.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah,
It's
or
the studies.
perestroika. Yeah.
People did studies on the let's use the trans stuff that Abe mentioned. People did studies. Those studies were suppressed because they came to the wrong conclusions. Those studies are now not being suppressed, or it's coming to light that they were suppressed, right? Things like that. It is this sort of this transparency awakening, that it's like information that was here, that existed, but was suppressed, underneath, is now sort of coming out, and it feels like this sort of global glass-nosed type of wave.
Well, and the way it started out, this is why the Samuels piece, for anyone who's interested in how this both developed and then collapsed so quickly, he uses the Iran nuclear deal under Obama as his example because of the way the echo chamber was developed at that point in time was novel. And it worked for a while, but then it collapsed. It was actually built on a house of sand, but it took a while, and it did a lot of damage, obviously, on the international front. And so the piece, in a way, serves as a warning against seeing that sort of infrastructure developing again. And it can develop just as easily on the right side of the aisle as the left. It is a means of amassing power and shaping public opinion using digital technology and digital platforms that have international reach, that have a lot of opacity in terms of how they work and why, and who they target and why. So it's a very good warning against, I think, for Republicans who are coming into power in a few weeks. Serves as a good warning to check their own priors when it comes to using these tools themselves.
Look, David Samuels surfaced the fact of the Iran nuclear deal echo chamber in a piece that he wrote for the New York Times Magazine in 2014 or 2015. I can't remember which year. And what was interesting about that is that it was a harbinger of things to come, because Ben Rhodes, who was the subject of the piece, now head of the Pod Save America network, or whatever the hell that thing is, podcasting network, spoke contemptuously of how easy he had found it to manipulate the press corps around the White House, because they were 27 years old and didn't know anything, he said. Now, why is this interesting? Because back in my day, it took 25 years to get to the White House as a reporter. Like you worked, you struggled, you fought your way through. You started at the school board, you went to the state capitol, you got to report on a senator, and maybe you then went to a couple of foreign bureaus, and then when you were at the summit of your career, you got to report on the White House. So at least you were older and seasoned, and you had seen everything, and you had written 10,000 stories, and you had some experience of politicians and their henchmen lying to you and trying to play you and all of that. And all that world collapsed.
I think
right? And then okay, go ahead.
I think the echo chamber, the Ben Rhodes echo chamber, is an important data point in this discussion, because I think what we're talking about collapsing here is kind of Obama's world, the world that he sought to create, this inevitable liberal edifice that would carry on forever because it was self-evidently just and right and moving toward ever more justice and rightness.
And so the contempt, see, that's what's interesting about the contempt, which is that Rhodes could have contempt for these people who were, after all, serving his interests and doing what he wanted them to do, because it was self-evident.
Everyone has contempt for their toadies. I mean, that's just a rule of human
nature. Yes,
right?
but the other way of looking at it is that he thought, again, that sort of the ends justified the means. That is to say, maybe he was feeding them crapola ideas about Iran. The deal was self-evidently a wonderful thing, and therefore whatever methodology he used to get it across the finish line was acceptable, not only acceptable, but morally praiseworthy. And that's why I say it's partially a harbinger of things to come, because this is what happened in the Trump years also, and during the post-Trump years, which is that people who didn't know anything were confidently asserting all kinds of things about epidemiology and national security and the prosecutions under the foreign, under a foreign recognized
Biological basis of
registered foreign
sex.
agent, biological basis people. So, like, I'm not saying that there was epistemological modesty in the days before the internet blew up American journalism or reporting, but there was some sense of proportion. And, the world of the 2020s is a world in which people can confidently assert 3 hours after congestion pricing is introduced in Manhattan that it's working. I mean, literally, there were like 10,000
And also
tweets
the
about how
pressure.
wonderfully well it was working, and it had started in a snowstorm on a Monday, the first Monday after vacation, and we don't know if it's working. There's no way of knowing that it's working. We don't know that things work or don't work that fast.
But there's also the sort of the pressure to conform to that style of thinking, not even necessarily the same opinions, but oh, you don't have a strong opinion on seed oils? How could you not have a strong opinion on seed oils today? It's already Tuesday. That's kind of like, what's the thing of the week?
Yeah.
By Wednesday, everybody should be an expert in that sort of thing. And so then we all just sort of, it's a weird monoculture thing, right? Which is like the internet expanded all these horizons, but the kind of, what my former colleague used to call guild bullying inside each industry
Mm-hmm.
pushes everybody into like the same door, through the same doorway. And so now it's like we're all talking about seed oils, and next week we're all going to be talking about something else, and we're all going to be doing it with surprisingly limited grasp of the concept, which was the whole point of the internet broadening our horizons and democratizing the public space and the public square, was so that you could have all this information at your fingertips. But really, we sort of ended up having all the opinions at your fingertips.
Because your crazy aunt at the dinner table who has a strong opinion about seed oils and has done the deep dive is given just as much weight because of the architecture of the platform as the nutrition scientist with 30 years experience studying seed oils. It's the same.
Right.
There's no difference there.
But the other thing that we learned, and I think is important because it goes to, like, as I say, sort of like whom we look to for expertise, not the crazy aunt, but the nutrition scientist, is that then it turned out that the nutrition scientist wasn't even a nutrition scientist, by which I mean that the leading public health official in Los Angeles, California, the second largest city in the country, had a BA in communications from Brandeis University.
Well, and they all want to
She was
become
not a
influencers
doctor.
now, too.
She was not an epidemiologist.
Yeah.
She was not a data scientist. She was nothing. She was a democratic political hack who was closing restaurants and shutting down parks and things like that. And who the hell was she? And once that door cracks open, I think partially Abe's point here, right? Once that door cracks open, you can't close it again. I mean, you can. It will close again because there are places where you are. There are things you need expertise for, right? You're not gonna like go in and punch a hole in your own wall and fix your plumbing unless you're really, really skilled. You can't do that. But it is in this weird combination of public policy and
Challenge accepted, John.
I'm sorry. What can I tell you? But I'm just saying, like,
I grew
are
up
things
watching Home Improvement, so you know.
Yeah, well, there you go. I'm just saying, like, there are things in which obviously we need expertise more than ever because things are so incredibly complicated, and you wouldn't question it all that much. But then there are things where it turns out that the people who are supposed to know more than we do don't. A disinformation specialist who was hired by the Department of Health and Human Services to run a disinformation department, who again was like, I don't know, writing erotica on the web. I can't even remember what the hell it was that she did. She had no expertise. There is no such thing as expertise in disinformation because one man's disinformation is another man's information. But, that's not true of data science. Where, data science also would incline you toward a certain degree of epistemological modesty,
That was
right?
always Andy Ferguson's point in the many things that he's written over the years on social science, right? Which
Yeah.
was the idea that we do have things that are science. We do have hard sciences. They
Mhm.
exist, and we do have mathematics. They exist. And we do have things that can be measured in numbers and that we know how to research and how to test hypotheses and all this stuff. And what happened over the years was that we added to the category of science things that weren't science, and now everything is treated as a science, and it makes us suspect, unfortunately, of the things that are actually science, which do still exist
That
and can still be tested.
an important point because, for example, so we got RFK right lined up to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, and he's a kook. And I don't mean he's a kook because we should then say, oh, this is like saying that Viktor Orban is a fascist. He's not really a kook. He is a kook. He has argued things that are not true. He makes stuff up. He's really bad. However, the epistemological modesty of genuine science says things like this. You know, there's fluoride in the water. 330 million people are dealing with fluoride in the water. And what we know from large data sets is that there is a tiny but measurable number of people who might be adversely affected by fluoride in the water. Maybe they have an allergy. Maybe there's this. Maybe there's something in their own systems, whatever. Just as we learned that there was a small but measurable effect potentially on young men between the ages of 15 and 30 from the COVID vaccine, who then should have been in a position to make a choice about the COVID vaccine because so few people between the ages of 15 and 30 were dying from COVID. And that since there was some idea that there was a myocardial infarction risk associated with the COVID vaccine in this one subpopulation that was not
Myocarditis,
horribly at
yeah.
risk from COVID. What?
Myocarditis.
Myocarditis. I'm sorry. But that conversation was not permissible because the idea was if you went down that road, then you were going to tell people that it was okay for them not to get the vaccine, and so you weren't going to allow that to happen. So this is where you get the problem that I think, Christine, you said Republicans need to, or conservatives need to check their priors, because yeah, fluoride in the water has been an unbelievably successful 3-generation experiment in ending tooth decay in the United States as a major problem. But you can't say that it is completely risk-free, because nothing is risk-free at all. And then once you're in a position where you have these propagandists and tort lawyers and all of that, an article is published that says, yeah, there's some, there are potentially minor risks from fluoride in water to some people. Then you got, you see, they've been covering up for 70 years. They've been covering up the danger of fluoride.
That's the perfect combination of the fact that we now govern from extreme exceptions to the rule. We do not trust the people who lay down the rules in the first place. And you have platforms that allow for everyone to do their own work and find their own, conspiracy rabbit hole to go down to prove the extreme. And so that combination of those things leads to exact policy making that is just absolutely insane at the end of the day, with regard to things that, look, there have been countries that have removed fluoride from the water and then gone back to putting fluoride in the water because of the actual measurable increase in cavities in children in particular. So we have plenty of evidence, but you're right that it doesn't, the exceptions are governing so much of our politics right now that it's difficult to come to compromise or to acknowledge the range of non-Manichaean interpretations of just regular things about life.
I think we should talk a little bit. We did not get a chance to talk about interestingly relating to Hungary, maybe a little bit, Joe Biden's Medal of Freedom grantees over the weekend. The most controversial, I guess, being George Soros, the billionaire of Hungarian Jewish descent, who has served as the counterpoise ideologically, personally, in terms of his own efforts to build institutions inside his home, his birth country of Hungary. George Soros against Viktor Orban, whom we talked about earlier. But the world of the Biden's conduct in the last month of this presidency is uniquely suggestive of the reason that he would have, had he not had mental problems, mental acuity issues, and had stayed in the race, he would have lost anyway. I think because his root instincts went totally off the rails once he became president and did not have institutional boundaries of the Senate or institutional boundaries of the vice presidency or something like that. And I think that this helps explain this very peculiar decision to try to permanently ban the outer shelf oil exploration, because I'm trying to figure out why he bothered, why he's doing it. It's probably not going to work and all of that. Because I think the idea that he can enjoin future presidents from action seems demented. But somebody came to him, in my estimation, and said, as they said, you can be the greatest climate president ever if you do this. Similarly, ban Nippon Steel from buying U.S. steel. So you will be known as the greatest pro-union president ever. And if you go to Joe Biden and you say in his ear, you will be FDR, you will be Lincoln, you will be this, that's all you need to do to get this very thick, now, as I say, mentally compromised, but very thick, quite dumb, and weirdly instincted person to do what you want him to do. So if only somebody had said, you will be you will be like the king of you will be the hero of Yad Vashem if only you stay on Israel's. You will be considered the greatest president in Jewish history. Maybe he would have been enjoined from some of his bad behavior beginning in November of 2023 against Israel. But
he's been so cut off at the knees that he's trying to grasp at any brass ring, right? I mean, don't forget when he came into office, the historians he met with sat down. They put into his mind that he was destined for historic greatness in the first place. That clearly fell apart.
Yeah.
So now on the way out, he's trying to do something, some big thing, some swing for the fences that will enable him to go down in the books. I think the Medal of Freedom ceremony, the recipients are interesting because clearly so many of them he's trying to zing Trump and the right. Hillary Clinton, George Soros, George Romney. And he's sort of trying to say, we're still here and we're going to, the fight continues kind of thing. But I sort of read it as, I think we'll look back on it as, you had a good run, guys. Here's your gold watch. It's over.
Right. That's the other way to see it, which is that Biden is leaving office and Mitt Romney, who, I have a ton of respect for, but he's leaving office.
But George Romney.
But Mitt Romney, he gave the medal to George Romney, but Mitt Romney, it was there to accept it. And the scene was supposed to be Mitt Romney and Hillary Clinton and all these people that you don't think the political element of what Abe is saying is we wouldn't know George Romney if he got out of his grave and walked into the room. But
no, George Romney, he knows. George Romney is fine. George Romney is like from his 20s.
Right, that's true.
Maybe he doesn't know who Mitt Romney is.
The picture was to put Mitt Romney up there one last time, right? To take a shot at all this stuff.
I don't know.
And I think there are a lot of them, they're obviously all leaving the scene in a way. And I think like you put your grandparents on a cruise.
I disagree because you know who accepted George Soros' award? Alex Soros, his son, who spent the last year putting pictures on his social media of every single major Democrat on the bench, the people who are supposedly the next generation of Democratic leadership, like trophy heads he'd gotten on his African savanna hunt. I mean, this guy, he is a player. He has a lot of money. He has a lot of influence. He sits on a lot of boards of NGOs and nonprofits on the left. So you could argue that while, giving the gold watch to a lot of these guys, he was also signaling, look, here's the next gen of our funders.
I'll say two things about that. One way to look at that is that George Soros didn't bother to show up to the White House to receive a Medal of Freedom. And the other is, look at the Harris campaign. You can spend as much money as you can print, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get anywhere with it. And I think we're in a place where it takes more than throwing billions at a cause
And
to
also,
get something happening.
Yeah.
There's just something else with the Harris campaign, which is, now that you bring it up, which is that these very rich liberal donors, they establish huge foundations and the money trickles down, right? Where did we see that money trickle down to, right? Danielle Pletka wrote this great cover piece for Commentary Magazine about how a lot of the money that came to the Tentifada groups and these more extreme radicalized groups on campus was trickling down from, from on high, the top of the mountain, the Soroses to some of these foundations, which then give to other foundations, which then give to other foundations, and cutouts to cutouts and cutouts and blah, blah, blah. But the money really does start at that top. And if anything, all that stuff hurt the Harris campaign, right? I mean,
Well, it hurt her freedom of mobility, certainly, in the
but also
sense, right?
the fight over the war was these groups were empowered by these same money men, right?
Yeah.
And in Michigan, it exploded in their face, arguably.
It's all very interesting how people go out the door, right? It's all, so the worst person to ever go out the door was Trump. Went out the door the worst possible way. It was horrible, right? You had bitterness in 2000 when Bush was sort of mandated president by the Supreme Court, and you had Clinton people taking the ease off the keyboards of on the computers in the West Wing as some kind of weird, middle finger to the incoming Bush people. And then you had like Bush, who gave all kinds of Bush was incredibly gracious, and so how people go out the door, is an interesting matter. I don't know how Jill Biden is going to go out the door. Seriously. I mean, how many more documents is she going to sign?
Still waiting for that pardon of his brother, which has got to come.
Oh, that will happen on the morning of the 20th, right? That will happen.
My old rabbi used to say that the way you went into Shabbos was the way that you would go into the next world. That if you were rushing and you needed the extra 18 minutes and you didn't finish everything and you didn't plan, then that's how you go into the next world, that you leave things unfinished. So we could move that over to this and apply it and say the way you leave office in DC is the way you will enter the next world. If you're pardoning bad people and, handing out gifts to your friends and all sorts of stuff like that, the way you go out is actually quite significant.
And we should say, I think, I'm just going to say something nice just for the hell of it. According to Susie Wiles yesterday in Axios, she, the incoming White House Chief of Staff, has been treated extraordinarily well by the outgoing White House Chief of Staff, which is Jeff Zients. I don't know how to pronounce his name, Zients. But she said that
I think it rhymes with science.
Had them over to dinner, has been incredibly gracious, and it's worth noting that has taken place while we make fun of a lot of this other stuff. Hey, Christine, you have a recommendation.
I do. It's not a new book, but it's a book that when it first came out, I read sections of. I was a undergraduate history major at the time, but I had an opportunity to revisit it over the holidays, and it so struck me as something I enjoyed, and as an artifact of the way even academic history used to be written in the 1990s, something I would like to recommend. And it's a book called Mystic Chords of Memory, The Transformation of Tradition in American Culture by historian Michael Kamen. Michael Kamen won the Pulitzer for a book he wrote called People of Paradox, which is also excellent. But Mystic Chords of Memory came out, I think, in 1991. And it is a vast, sprawling, almost 900 pages, so it is a doorstopper, cultural history of America. And the question he starts with, and I think in some ways never quite answers, which is what makes the book really fun to read, is how does a young nation that is always looking to the future and trying to capture progress, harness progress, how does it have a past? How does it create a history for itself? So he looks at, because he had this, he's an incredibly idiosyncratic historian who could actually write beautifully. Those two things, both rare in academia and in academic history, unfortunately. He just found all these unusual stories. The book is full of wonderful images. He talks about, the creation of things like Old Town Alexandria or Disneyland and Disney World, and the sort of the way you could almost bureaucratize nostalgia for the purposes of entertainment, and why Americans loved that sort of thing and what it said about us as a people. And I mean, it starts in at the founding of the country and goes all the way up to, I think, it ends around Reagan's term. So it's just great fun. If you don't want to read it all start to finish, you can pick a chunk of history. So I think one of the most overlooked times in American history that is also culturally rich are the late 19th, early 20th century. A lot of wacky stuff going on, a lot of interesting threads to pull there. And that section is one of my favorites, but you can kind of dive in and just read bits and pieces. It's just a beautiful book. And he taught at Cornell for a long, long time. He passed away a few years ago, and he was a wonderful scholar. All of his books worth reading, but I would recommend Mystic Chords of Memory by Michael Kamen.
That's Michael Kamen.
Kammen.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, we will be back with you tomorrow. For Christine, Seth, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.